There we go. Hi, everybody. This is Alex. Adam's not here today. He's down in Bermuda, I think, sitting on some luxury hotel balcony looking out over the sea. And he's left it to us. And so while he's away, we will play. Tonight we have a discussion about sensor sense, as we're calling it. And it's an introduction to the terms and to the concepts that one needs to know when one is selecting a camera or a sensor for their imaging rig. It's a rather elementary session. We've split it into two parts. The first part's today and the next part's next week. I don't have any information about the image of the week, and so we're going to skip that part. I do encourage you all, as we always do, to turn in your entries for image of the week. You can go to the website for the Astro-imaging channel, and you can see links to how to turn in those images. We're interested in all sorts of images that relate to the celestial happenings, so I encourage you to do that. As always, you are encouraged to follow along either on YouTube or in the room, and go ahead and contribute to the conversation. If you have questions, you can ask them along the way by typing in. Over on one part of your screen, you'll see some Google Apps for comments or for questions and answers. Depending on how you're watching, you can either type into the comments or type the questions and answers. And we will occasionally break and look into whatever it is that you have to ask. One other thing while I get my screen share going here is that we ask you always to, oh yes, we are always looking for presenters. So if you have a concept that you would like to share with all of us, I would encourage you to get a hold of Adam. Contact him through the Astro-imaging channel there, and you will be able to, you'll get a chance to make a presentation like this. As you can see from the from my my presentation today, you don't have to be totally competent. You don't have to be a smooth presenter. You don't have to be. You just have to have some good ideas and be willing to share them with other people. So. David and Eric, are we showing my splash screen there?
You are.
Okay, well then let's get started. Tonight we're going to do part one, basic ideas. It's going to be an introduction to the various sensors out there and how they're used. And it's going to be of interest to the beginner because it does explain some of the language that we use. If you're about to modify your DSLR, cool it down, or change the filters in it somehow or another, there'll be some definitions of terms that you might want to pick up on tonight. If you're in a transition, you've been doing astro-imaging for a while, but you're wondering if you should move into something bigger and better, it's for you. And if you're trying to match the camera to your tube and subject, the words that we're going to be talking about, the words that we're going to be defining today, are going to help you a little bit. Now, we're not going to be covering some things. A few months ago, we had a topic on the Astro-imaging channel about moving from DSLRs to CCDs. And we got about 15 minutes into it or something, and we started talking about the qualities of various CCD sensors and why one's better than the other and what their signal-to-noise ratio is at certain quantum efficiencies. And we went on for about 5 minutes of that, and somebody very brilliantly, very cogently typed in the comment there, and it said, "What are you guys talking about? I tuned in to find out about moving up to a DSLR, and you guys are way beyond any of that stuff. Or move up to CCD, and you guys are way beyond that." That's not going to happen tonight. If you need specific sensor information, go ahead and type in the question, but we may not get around to answering it tonight. There's a place and a time for that, and this isn't it. Also, unfortunately, this conversation that we're having is going to take a lot longer than I originally planned. And so instead of just making you sit here for 2 hours, so listening to it all, there's another way to do this. We split it into two parts. And so coming May 15th will be the big questions you have to ask. Just when somebody's about to buy a new camera, they have certain things they want to know, and that's what we're going to talk about next time. Today's for definitions, basic concepts, and 2 weeks from now on May 15th we're going to come back and we're going to talk about some of the big questions. I'm going to be a little sloppy in my use of the word sensor. Sometime in this conversation I'm going to be talking about just the chip, the little chip that converts photons into some kind of an electron count to see how much light every pixel's gathered. Sometimes when I say sensor, I'm going to be using the idea of the whole camera, because when you buy something, you don't just buy a chip. You buy the camera and the cooling system and the filters and the micro lenses and the input-output system and all the stuff that goes with it. There's no need to quibble about which one I'm using. They're pretty obvious in context. Second thing that I want to clarify here is that there are basically three types of cameras that are used in astro-imaging. There's the astro camera, what some people call a CCD, but that's probably going to be inappropriate for too long, because in fact sometimes it's a CMOS, which are two slightly different technologies. But the thing that makes them an astro camera, in my definition, is that they have regulated cooling. And that regulated cooling combined with that CCD or CMOS chip and all the other things mean that you're a very, very serious astro imager as far as this camera goes. Now you can also be very serious with DSLRs. DSLRs, however, are a great introduction to this hobby. They can either be stock or modified. And there's a third kind of camera that we can talk about. It's video-based. The first two types of camera take single shots, and the third camera, the video-based, takes hundreds of shots, dozens of them per second, and then puts them together in some way or another so that they come up with a good image. So those are the three camera types we're going to talk about, and frankly, they've got uses depending on what you're taking pictures of. There are many different types of pictures that you can be taking, and if you've decided that you're going to take one or another of these, you need to look at getting a camera that supports that particular kind of imaging. It's not as if you can't take a picture with a different camera or different type of camera. It's just a lot easier if you get the right kind of camera in the first place. The first type of images out there are nightscapes. They're generally full color, big scenes. The important thing here is that they're a changing scene. You can't take multiple images, generally speaking, because the Milky Way is moving. People are moving in the foreground. Things are changing. So you've got to catch the scene all at once. And the camera of choice for that is a modern DSLR. A second type of imaging is a lot different. This is you're looking for real high resolution planets and solar and lunar. And in high-resolution imaging, it's real tough because the atmosphere itself is shaking. And what you want to do is you want to, these could be either mono or color pictures, or they could be mono pictures if somebody's colored with them. You guys wonder where I was when I took this picture? I was in at my desktop in Photoshop putting two pictures together. But if you really want to catch the ISS going in front of the moon, you probably want to be taking with the video camera or using the video capability of your DSLR. These things are highly seeing dependent, and with that kind of a camera, you can freeze seeing better. The third kind, and this is the money shot for most of us, is the pretty pictures. The pretty picture objects are generally very, very dim. They take very long exposures, and they need something that can sit there open for a long time taking a single picture. They're generally very colorful, and we want to bring out those colors. And to do that, we use a DSLR, a modified DSLR, or a true astro camera. The video cameras are not generally too good at this kind of work. So this is the kind of camera you'd want to use if you were taking deep space pictures. There's another category of pictures that I call transients, and the thing about them is that they are constantly changing, and they are generally very, very colorful. You want to capture those colors, and to do that, you want a one-shot color camera of one side or another. What type of another? A cooled astro camera, one-shot color, is good for this. DSLR is very good for this also because it can capture everything all at once. When things are changing, when the comet is moving among the stars, you kind of need to capture that all at once, or you're really asking for a lot of processing difficulties. Now there's one place where video and video-based DSLR really excels, and that's in video-assisted astronomy. This is some of my buddies down at Southern California Desert Video Astronomers. If you ever get a chance to go out to Joshua Tree area and hang around these people, this is a 22-foot by 10-foot tall, basically big projection screen. They've taken over a RV resort where they used to show movies on Saturday nights or something like that, and they've taken it over and they show pictures of deep space objects live, and sometimes, as you can see in this case, they've got music. It's a great outreach thing, but you want a video camera for doing that generally, a Malin cam or something like that. You can use the video output of a DSLR, or even, if you want to do it sequentially, take a DSLR still picture and then project it up there. There's the last type of camera, or the last type of imaging that I think people get into when they're doing astro-imaging, and that's scientific imaging. You might remember Bob Stevens and Bob Buckheim have done presentations on this before. They want a different kind of camera yet than the ones we've been talking about. Since they're very data-oriented, they want to shoot just mono. They're not interested so much in the colors. They'll sometimes shoot through different color filters to get different kinds of information. But what's critical to them is that everything be closely calibrated. They have to know exactly what each pixel is reporting. And if it's reporting that in one shot, it's got to report it the same over and over again. So they tend to use cooled CCDs so they can get the best images for that. I'm going to stop here for questions. The first time through here, all we've done so far is say that there are basically three types of cameras that one can use for taking images of the sky like that, and each of them have their strengths in different areas depending on which type of image you want to take. David or Eric, are there any questions in the room yet?
I haven't seen any
okay.
on any of the streams so far.
Okay, good. Let's go on to do that whole thing all over again on target specialization. You know, depending on what you're taking a picture of, you may want to take a different kind of camera. This time we're going to analyze it according to spectrum. You know what the spectrum is. It goes from gamma rays all the way to radio waves and stuff like that. In between, there is the visible, and we're really concerned in our pretty picture efforts with taking this stuff right in through here. From right down in from the blue up to red, right about here is where most of our cameras are sensitive. Actually, some of our cameras are also near infrared. I never did fix that slide, did I? In the near infrared is what that says in most scientific journals. It's important that you control the near infrared, and you have to do certain things in order to control the near infrared from messing up your focusing and stuff like that. Usually it's done with particular types of filters. Matter of fact, the DSLRs, when they come out of the box, they have an infrared filter on it. But that infrared filter also takes out some of the red that we want. Here's a picture of NGC 7000, the North American nebula, taken with a standard DSLR. And then you remove that near infrared and upper red filter, and this is much more light. See how much more you get? This is why it's important to know which spectrum you're dealing with. So, realizing that we want to talk about the spectrum, let's go on and look at some objects. We're going to look at different classes of objects. There are several types of full spectrum objects, like open clusters and globular clusters. They tend to be white or blue-white, and they've got other colors in them. So you want something that can capture the full color. Not necessarily at one time. It could be a mono camera with filters, or it could be a one-shot color. But you want to be able to emphasize all colors. Same thing with galaxies. Galaxies, by definition, emit lights in all colors because the sun emits lights in all colors, and suns are all colors. So galaxies are full spectrum objects. Planetary objects, and I just realized that this Arches in Arches National Park, or wherever that is, landscape arch under the Pleiades and Orion here, that really is a planetary picture. It's just taken much closer than this one was taken. By the way, all these pictures are my pictures, except if they're noted, like this is Damien Peaches. I've never been able to get a picture of a planet. But they are also full spectrum objects, and so you want to be able to catch all of the colors that are involved. Now we get into special spectrum objects. Certain objects glow better in certain gases glow. When you heat up hydrogen to a certain temperature, it glows like a fluorescent lamp, and an emission nebula will be red like this. By the way, this is the you know, the spider and the fly. That big. This is the fly here when it's really blown up. It's also called the Little Orion Nebula because it's got its own little trapezium and it's got a dust cloud. Okay, enough of that. But you'll notice also there's a reflection nebula in here. These are red, and these reflection nebula of dust and bright stars, the bright stars illuminate the dust. Planetary nebula are usually, well, they're a little different, they form a little differently, but also I didn't have a good picture of a planetary nebula, so I stuck in M46. And there is a planetary nebula in it, and you'll notice that it's kind of a bluish green. Capture that kind of stuff. And you may want to take a picture of something that is an emission nebula like this, and if you're doing it with a standard DSLR, you can do it, but you just can't do it very well. And so before you go buying a camera, you have to decide whether you're getting the right camera based on the spectrum of the objects you want to shoot. Some objects are mono objects. The sun. We often see sun pictures colorized, but they're really black and white objects. The moon also would be a mono object, and you might want to forego a color camera if you're going to be focusing on this kind of an object. There's also a special situation. These are actually full color images, and you can see with the hydrogen alpha glowing in here, you'd really want some kind of it's the same class we talked about earlier with hydrogen alpha emission nebula and stuff like that. Actually, that's not an emission nebula, that's a dark nebula. But at any rate, narrowband imaging means that instead of taking a broad band of blue, a broad band of green, and a broad band, you want very specific colors. You only let one little part of the spectrum in. For H beta or O3, hydrogen alpha or S2, and you just get that little bit. Now, this doesn't change the object that you're looking at, but it enables you to image in very special conditions. So if you're interested in narrowband imaging, which you can do from your backyard. Both of these pictures were taken from my backyard in the suburban Los Angeles area, and believe me, I've got lights all over the place here, but these pictures were gathered in my backyard. But in order to do this, you need a camera that's capable of accepting this kind of filter. So think out what kind of targets you're going to want when you decide to buy a camera, particularly if you're rich enough to buy, 8 different cameras for 8 different operations. We'll get around to that when we get to May 15th. We'll talk a little bit about how to compromise. How are we doing on questions or comments, guys?
None so far.
Okay.
No, I don't see any.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Moving into the next part, we're going to be talking about how a sensor actually works. Everybody's got to understand that we're not talking about photons anymore. We're talking about raindrops. These are all raindrops, and they're falling into buckets. All right, and the way a sensor works, all sensors work something along these lines. You expose a photodiode. You collect the rain in buckets. And then you measure, the rain is converted into electrons. The photons are converted into electrons. By the photoelectric effect that, Einstein got his Nobel Prize for in 2005. I think that's what he got it for. He wrote 3 papers that year. I think it was the photoelectric effect that won it, whatever it was. So it converts it, and depending on how many photons it takes to get you an electron, or how many of the photons that hit actually get converted to a reading, that's the quantum efficiency of that particular pixel. Anyway, the next step is to transfer all those electrons to an amplifier, and the way that's done in a CCD is that all the buckets move down and dump everything into this serial bucket array, and it's a conveyor belt that goes down and dumps it, and then this array comes down and it dumps it out. In a CMOS sensor, each one of these buckets is connected to its own set of electronics behind here, and it does it that way. okay, and measures it, and they record the output. Oh, they all go to an amplifier where the signal is amplified a little bit so it's easier to read. They record that, measure the contents of it, and then they digitize it. And this is what the digitizing looks like. You get analog digital units. And you're going to want to know what the ADU of your sensor is eventually, what it can read out as. And for those of you who are real basic, it's just starting out, if you have a swath of light come through, the more photons that hit, the more ADU you're going to get. So this one here, you might not be able to read this by the time it gets translated on YouTube with all the loss of resolution you get, but where'd I go? Where'd I go? Where'd I go? That's a 2, corresponds to this pixel over here. It's not very bright. Then it's a 3, 3, 2, 3, 16, all the way up to 150, 170. So the brighter it is, the higher that number. Okay, and that's all it is. You've just changed your raindrops. You've counted them. You've multiplied them with an amplifier. You've changed them into analog digital units according to some set gain, and the gain is your conversion factor that converts the number of electrons you've got into your reading, and you can then store a record of in each pixel how bright it was. That's all that's happening. So see, these are all photons. Aren't they pretty photons? Just little balls of light coming down. Their job is to come down and hit the sensor. This is the sensor, and this is the full well. So all these raindrops are going to come down and hit the sensor. But I got to tell you something. First off, there's noise. So in the first box up here, no matter what you do, there's going to be noise, heat. Particularly builds up, and you can't tell heat from light. They're both photons, and so it counts it. All right. Secondly, photons can fill up the well. This is a structure, an electronic structure that actually holds the number of photons and the number of electrons that it translates into. Now, you can change the pixel dimension, and you'll get less photons, less electrons sitting in that well. Or you can change the structure again, make them deeper, and you can get more. The depth of your well, or the well depth, how much you get, depends on how many electrons you can store, depends on the well depth, depends on the size of the sensor, what the sensor is made of, and so forth and so on. Now, notice that there's things falling in all over the place. There's photons coming in from all over the place. But if you look down here, and this is either a CMOS or a CCD sensor, they both look about the same at this level. You'll notice that blue part right there is the actual sensor, and the part around it is electronics. Here's another picture of it. So you can see how it can easily count the rain coming in right here. But if a raindrop were to hit right here, if a photon were to hit right here, it wouldn't get in. So this photon would just slip right on by. This photon would slip right on by. This one over here, this one over here. The only photons that this thing could count are the ones that are directly above it, hitting a parallel rays right in there. Unless you did this. You put a big funnel up there, and that funnel now can catch these rays, these photons that are coming down here, and direct them in. These coming down here. It'll still miss these, it'll still miss that, still miss that one, but it'll collect most of them. If you put a whole bunch of these funnels up here, you get what's called a microlens. So those of you who are wondering what a microlens capability is on your sensor, that's what it's doing. It's reaching out and gathering any photons that aren't directly originally above the pixel. Also, in many sensors, if you've got a one-shot color camera, such as in a DSLR, or a one-shot color video camera, you have, or a one-shot color Astro cameras, they all exist. You have what's called a Bayer array. And that Bayer array is a collection of filters that, after it's gone through the microlens, it comes through the green filter, and green is the only light that this sensor senses. And green is the only one. This sensor, actually all 4 of these get just green. These 3 are a red, a blue, and a red. The next 4 are all green, and it goes like that all the way through. We're not going to spend too much time on the barrel array right now. In 2 weeks, when we talk about the difference between CCDs, or between one-shot color and mono cameras, we'll talk a little bit about that. But at any rate, that's what they look like. Now, let's go back to the well depth. If you fill up a well and you've still got room for stuff, then you've got some room to maneuver. You've got to get above that read noise, the read noise and the dark noise, and you want to fill it up to here. This sensor right here looks like, or this picture right here, is what happens when you don't have a saturated sensor. This is a saturated sensor. It's completely full. Any other photons hitting there are going to bounce off, they're going to go away, whatever they're going to do, but you can't get any more in there. Now here, there may be a saturated a pixel right in the middle, but as you go around, they're not saturated, so they're not quite that bright. You can see in the histogram here that it's off the left wall, and so it's got a good distribution, comes all the way up, and then it pretty much peters out before it's absolutely maxed out. But if you've saturated your sensor, that means you've filled it up so completely that it can't really register anymore. And you're still exposing, well, then you're going to fill up other sensors around that shouldn't be that bright. You can never get that information back. You can darken everything if you want, but see these saturated pixels over here? They're going to say saturated, and you can never get the information back. You can move back the ones in the middle a little bit, so the ones that are semi-dark will become darker, but you can never get the information back out of that. So you don't want to get to saturation. All right, and so you need to know what the full well saturation of your pixels are before you go out shopping for a camera. And you need to take shorter exposures, which is another way of doing it. You might also hear the term blooming and anti-blooming gates, or anti-blooming technology. Remember, I said what happens is that all the photons hit and then they start spilling out. Well, you can control that. You can put in a anti-blooming gate, and what happens is as the photons hit, they get converted to electrons, and the electrons fill up. And as they fill up, they get higher and higher, and then they finally start draining off. All right, so before they actually get all the way to full, they start draining off. They actually can get completely full eventually if you don't watch out. And the problem with that is that you get these long streaks. And you can do things processing-wise to get rid of them, but you never want to get to the point where you have to process something out when you could have taken it in a different way and get good information in the first place. That's called blooming. And in order to understand it better, and there's a couple of concepts here that are important. Saturation is the same. In any given chip, it's the same. In any given chip, it's the same. So we're going to get to saturation eventually if we keep putting photons onto the pixel. But there is a linear range, and that means that for every photon that comes in, you get a set number of electrons coming out in the conversion factor. And if you put in 1, let's say you'll get out 1. If you put in 5, you'll get out 5. If you put in 50, you'll get out 50. All right? And that's true even with an anti-blooming gate. But look what happens with an anti-blooming gate. About halfway up, you start draining off, and where you might get 1 to 1 here, for every 1 extra photon you get here, you're only getting maybe half an electron out. Okay, well, there's no such thing as half an electron, so let's just say it takes 2 or 3 photons eventually to be getting the value of 1 electron out up here. When you're taking flats and you keep saying, hey, what's this linear range they're talking about? You have to keep your exposures in this linear range. Otherwise, you don't have a good relationship between the amount of light you've gotten in there and the readings of your ADU. You also want to consider seriously whether, if you're doing scientific work, whether you want an anti-blooming case. You can do scientific work with an anti-blooming gate, but you have to be careful to keep all your exposures down in this range where everything is linear and has a 1 to something relationship. In a non-blooming gate, it's all the way until it gets saturated. In a blooming gate, at some point, it stops. In an anti-blooming gate, at some point, it stops. So just be careful of that. That's the definition of anti-blooming and linearity, things that you might need to know when you're investigating which chip to buy, which camera to buy. Once again, it's time for questions.
So there is one question. Yanni is saying, hey, beautiful pictures. Do you use any light pollution filters?
No, I don't. The pictures taken from home are with narrowband. The pictures of the nightfall pictures or the nightscape pictures are taken in dark places because it's out in nature, national parks and things like that. Thank God for our national parks keeping them clean. And the most of the LRGB pictures are taken out at a dark sky site where I don't have to worry about light pollution so much. So no, I don't, and I really am not the one to ask about light pollution filters. I just don't have a need for them, and I don't use them. So, but I know other people do and get good value out of them. Okay, what do you want to do when you're buying a sensor, a camera? You could have found this page on SBIG or FLI or just any one of a number of places. Of course, it wouldn't have had the QSI picture on it. I went to QSI, and you get the same thing wherever you go. You're going to get unsurpassed image quality. That's like a restaurant saying we got great food. Okay, that doesn't tell you anything. But this next line, as far as what you want to look for when you're buying something, is extremely important. As a matter of fact, once you got the mechanics and the connections out of the way, this is the most important thing. Pixel size doesn't matter. Whether it's CMOS or CCD doesn't matter. Whether it's this or that, the other thing doesn't matter. If it's not going to get you on the qualities of extremely low noise and wide dynamic range. Those are the two things you want to look for more than anything else in your camera. Yes, it's cool that it connects with the USB 2.0, and we'll talk about what 16-bit output means in just a few minutes. The fact that it reads, this is the 600 series, mine's older, and it doesn't read nearly as fast as 8 megahertz. That you can cool to minus 50 degrees. You'll see why when we're discussing noise. That's important. The size of the sensor, all these things are cool, but really, extreme low noise and wide dynamic range is what you're after when you want to make good pictures. Let's look at what that kind of stuff means. It means you have to have a sensitive camera with a good well depth. We've talked about those two already. We're going to talk a little bit about signal to noise ratio, and then we're going to talk about dynamic range, digitization, and pixel chip dimensions and things like that. Let's go with sensitivity a little bit here. Sensors depend on which chip they're using, and you can see there's a number of chips. They're all over the place as far as how sensitive they are. This dark blue one, the KAI 11002, it's not so sensitive. Doesn't get you a good quantum efficiency. It's not converting but 40% of the photons that hit it. Whereas this red one up here, this red, the 3200 ME, it's converting nearly 60% of the photons that hit it into some kind of electron. Okay, so it's got a higher quantum efficiency. You want a high quantum efficiency if you can get it. Also, you'll notice a few other things. Now, they also vary by wavelength. Every chip is a little bit stronger down in the blue-green than it is up in the reds. And this matters a lot because, like a DSLR is also filtered up in the red, so that you may not be able to pull out everything you need in the reds with a typical DSLR, and it's something to consider. The sensitivity of your quantum efficiency can vary by the pixel size, by the media, depending on what the chip is doped with, and the electronics, how the manufacturer has put everything together so that it actually produces more quantum efficiency. Go back to this photo. Remember, we start with noise. Every pixel is going to have noise because of the heat of the camera and various other electronics in the camera that makes it a problem. And everyone's going to have some level of full well. Eventually, it will get full. What you want is the best signal to noise ratio. A signal is going to depend on your full well, and your noise is going to depend on how the camera is built and various other things. Um, a signal to noise, if you've got a signal to noise ratio of 1 to 1, look at the signal, the thing that we really want the picture of, and there's various definitions of signal. I'm going to get a little sloppy here, and then I'll fix it back up later. We're trying to take a picture of a camera, and you can't really see the camera in here because the camera deep down inside, there's so much noise, and the noise is equal to the camera. But as the signal to noise ratio gets higher, you can see that the camera emerges from the back. And the whole thing that, from the background noise, the whole thing we are trying to do is get that target noise, target signal to emerge out of the noise. That's what we're trying to do. That's why you want the most efficient, most sensitive camera with low noise and high dynamic range. I'm not going to go into the definition of noise. John Hayes did this about a month and a half ago. He did a great job. Noise is uncertainty in your signal, and it comes from a variety of things. Noise is generally a Poisson distribution, which means that it's coming in, singular events come in, and there's a formula for figuring out what the chances of any particular event coming in, depending on what the average rate of events coming in is. We're not going to go into all that stuff. But we are going to say is that signal is everything that registers on your pixel, wherever it comes from. If it's there, it's some kind of signal. Whether it's good signal, bad signal, wanted signal, unwanted signal is a whole other thing. It's composed of the target photons, the things that are actually coming from that faraway galaxy, and the ones that you wanted, plus shot noise or photon noise, dark noise, and read noise. All those things put together, and there are, if you really get into it, there are other kinds of noise that people know about. I don't bother myself too much with it, not being an engineer. But when they add all together, you get some kind of signal. We're going to look at some of these. Photon or shot noise is the noise you get from the fact that photons come in on a random basis. You can never be sure, even if the rate is, say, 10 per second, you can never be sure whether you're going to get 9, 8, 7, 10, 12, 13, 11. Average, you're going to get 10. But you can never be sure just how many you're going to get. So in any one picture, you might get a different picture. But if you add together lots and lots of pictures, you can actually see your target coming out from behind everything. So one shot may be pretty bad looking, but by the time you've added all of them together and blended them, you might get a whole lot more detail than you thought before. So that's shot noise, and it's inherent in the way photons act. Also, there's dark noise. It's due to thermal generation. As I said earlier, a sensor can't tell the difference between a photon caused by heat or a photon caused by the electromagnetic spectrum. They're measured in electrons, and electrons, RMS. RMS is a statistical way of giving you what the average electron is coming in. The ways to beat it, you cool the sensor. Check that graph out up here in the upper right-hand corner. At 10 degrees, you're going to get about 10 electrons per second, say. Yeah, electrons per pixel per second of noise, just dark noise. But if you cool that down to 0, it drops to about 3 1/3, and there's no such thing as a third of an electron, but and you cool it down to -20, which is where I image, and you should be running at about half on average electrons per of dark noise. So there's another way to fix it, and all good camera manufacturers will do this. They will zero out everything. They'll flush just before the exposure, and any dark noise that's there, they'll zip it out and get rid of it, called flushing. You also, in processing, subtract dark frames. Now, the dark frames have recorded what dark noise looks like in a typical frame, and it will subtract it from your light frame. And in subtracting it from the light frame, it removes the basement of that dark noise. Another thing you do is you combine many shots. And so if you have lots of noise, this dark noise, but you combine many shots, you'll get rid of a lot of it by statistical averaging. There's also read noise. What am I doing with this big? There we go. Down we go. Here we go. Read noise is generated by the camera itself. It's just weirdnesses in the cameras. Things aren't shielded sufficiently, or they may be shielded as well as they possibly can, but I mean, it's an almost impossible job. It is essentially these raindrops bouncing around in there, or raindrops from the, or photons from the heaters in the camera, or the transistors in the camera, or something. They're just randomnesses. And here, for instance, if you dump all the information here at 10 megahertz, all right, you're going to get something that looks about like this out here on the far right under G. Okay, and if you do that, it's not going to look very good. But if you slow down the way the camera is operating so that it's only delivering about 1.25 megahertz, you can see that there's a lot less read noise, a lot more details coming out, things like that. So read noise at 10 megahertz and read noise at 1.25. Everything in engineering is a compromise, and that engineer has to decide whether you're willing to sit there for 45 seconds waiting for this download to happen, or you want this download to happen in 8 seconds. And so, you know, you got your choices. And different kinds of cameras choose this, other kinds of cameras choose that. You have to make a choice as to what you want when you're how much read noise is going to come along with it. You can also take bias frames and dark frames and subtract them out, and you can combine many frames, and again, that's how you work on read noise. Again, I'm not going to go into the whole theory of read noise and the whole set of noise, but suffice it to say, you can go back and look at John's John's YouTube program on the Astro-imaging channel on the basic statistics for Astro-imaging. But for the astro-imager, the signal-to-noise ratio is basically your target electrons, the good ones, the ones you really wanted, divided by the square root of the target electrons again, plus the background, or background of electrons, I should say, plus the dark noise, plus the, which is usually, yeah, that's expressed there, times the read noise, or plus the read noise. You add all that together, you get the square root of it, and divide it into that, and that will give you a signal-to-noise ratio for most of us. Now, what are typical signal-to-noise ratios? They're all over the place, depending on what your temperature was, what your gain was, what the full well was. Well, not so much on that. What the readout noise, total system noise. I mean, you can go. I put this here. You can come back later and go check out the guy from Czech Republic. Is just collected all sorts of people from all over the world have sent him results of their cameras and what kind of they did a test. And if you're interested in seeing some comparisons of that, you go copy that web page and go look it up. However, having said that, all that was for the imager himself or herself. It's not about the what the manufacturer says. The manufacturer doesn't deal with all those different variables. He or she deals with read noise, basically the stuff that's coming out of the camera electronics, and a little bit about the dark noise. They ignore the shot noise and emphasize the read noise. They do measure the dark noise at specific temperatures. So when you go to a specifications page, you need to read them with some discernment. For instance, where it says the pixel dark current, that's the dark noise that I was talking about caused by the thermal energy. It's usually expressed in the number of electrons you're going to get per second, but make sure when you're comparing, you compare them at the same temperature, because with different temperatures, you get different dark current noises. Your intrinsic read noise, now that's how well a job that the manufacturer has done in reducing the noise that's inherent in the camera itself, and it's stated in electrons bar ms. Dynamic range is also usually listed, and we're going to talk a lot about dynamic range in just a minute or two here, so we're going to hold on to that. But so read these things with discernment. The manufacturer doesn't concern himself when he says signal to noise ratio with the same way we do in Astro-imagers. Are there any questions about that have come up so far? And I encourage all of you to go ahead and type your questions into the comments sections or the Q&A sections, depending on where you're looking. We encourage these comments and questions. It makes for a better session overall. How are we doing, David and Eric?
I don't see anything.
Okay, let's proceed then. Let's talk about dynamic range. It was one of those things that was listed in the where are we? We should be. Oh, we should be here, but we're out of order. Look at these two pictures. They're actually the same picture taken with two different sensors. This one over here on the right has a much higher dynamic range than this one on the left. Notice that they cover everything from fairly bright objects to fairly dim objects. But this one loses a lot in translation. This one, almost everything is saturated. Let's look to see some graphs of dynamic range. The human eye is pretty good. It can see something that's just barely above a hundredth of a decibel worth of intensity here, luxes. And it can come all the way up to here on a logarithmic scale to, what is that? Well, that's well up past 1,000. And on a log scale, that makes it very, 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 very bright. And it's pretty linear. Starts and goes. For every piece of input, you get the same piece of output. A CCD camera, however, while it can see things a little dimmer than the human eye, falls far short of seeing the things brighter than the human eye, or that the human eye can see. Film, however, can't pick up the really dim things, but seems to get better as it gets on brighter things. And somebody's selling the sensor that took this picture is this HDRC VGA-X. And as you can see all the different brightnesses, the colors of the brightnesses, even over here where it's all burned out. This picture on the right has a much higher dynamic range. The dynamic range, when it's quoted by a manufacturer, is the linear full well, which we've talked about several times, just how many electrons you can put in that full well, divided by the read noise, or the maximum light intensity that you can measure, that's the full well, divided by the light intensity, the minimum you can measure, which is caused by the readout noise. It's the junk that it's random, so it's not usable anymore. It's a ratio, and it's usually expressed in decibels. It can be expressed in percentages, but it's usually expressed in decibels. Okay, so the manufacturer has a different definition of signal-to-noise ratio than the average astro-imager has. He's just talking about how full a well is compared to the read noise. Now, different manufacturers may have slightly different definitions, and their definitions may vary. You can compare a QSI camera to a QSI camera because they use the same definitions. But you've got to watch out that you're not comparing a QSI camera straight unless you pay attention to what the conditions are for the testing to know what their dynamic ranges are. So be careful of that. The total camera noise is not the same thing as the signal-to-noise ratio because it depends on acquisition, processing, and the target that you've got. Because of this, the manufacturers very rightly, I think, say we're not going to deal with that. We're going to deal with the things that we're responsible for. The noises that we put out in our camera, that we just can't seem to fix the last of these noises. We'd love to get rid of all of them, and eventually we will, but they haven't yet, compared to how much light altogether we can gather. And that's their basic signal-to-noise ratio. Somewhat related to that, in terms of lightness to darkness and things like that, but it's not the same thing, is the digitization level of your camera. We need to spend a few minutes talking about that. If you've got one bit of information, things are either off, black, or on, white. So one bit gets this bottom line here, and as you can see from the histogram, it's either off are on entirely. If you have 4-bit readings, all right, you can have 16 steps. And look what the histogram looks like. If you have 8 bits, you can have 256 steps. If you've got 16, you can have 65,000 steps. So you can see that the more steps you have as in your digitization, the better you're going to be. Otherwise, you're going to get what's called posterization, which is these gaps in between the bright spots. What does posterization look like? I've made a picture. This is my M51 here, and this is 256 levels of brightness, and you can see gradations from the bright to the dim to the bright to the dim and so forth like that. But this one over here only has 8 different levels of brightness, and this is a posterized picture. You can see that everything that was kind of bright in here is all the same color bright, and then it's a little dimmer, so it's a little dimmer as it goes out. Where does this matter? Here's another Rob Gendler picture. I don't have a good picture of that. And where it matters is that when we first get our pictures, all the information is stuffed way down over here on the left-hand side. And we made this from here to here, out of the 65,000 levels that we've got available, our information may be in the first 4,000 levels. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to stretch those 4,000 levels out to cover 40,000. Well, the only way we can do that is if we've got lots of stuff in between that we aren't using yet. We can't see it here, but as we stretch it, it's going to come out. So the very dim things have to be stretched out. That's why we need more levels of data. So we try to go for 12, 14, and now most of us are going for 16-bit digitization level. So you want a camera that can put out as much as you can reasonably handle. ADU conversion, converting the number of electrons into the number of ADUs, or the exposure values, comes in steps. And the more steps you have, the more chances you have of getting smooth gradations from dark to light. Let's talk about pixel size. We already talked that a wide, broad pixel are going to give you more electrons than a skinny one. Now you could deepen the box by adding electronics and changing things around a little bit, but basically the wider your pixels, the bigger your pixels, the bigger your light buckets. And smaller pixels have finer resolution because you just have a smaller pixel, means you're sampling a smaller part of the data. All right, and see this big asterisk? It means all things being equal, and they very rarely are, particularly in the world of DSLR development, where early cameras that might have been 1 megapixels got smaller pixels, but they got better pixels than the older pixels. And because of that, things weren't equal, and they had deeper wells, they could hold more. And so even though they were smaller pixels, they were smaller pixels, but the pixels could hold more, they could convert more. So things are not always equal. You don't necessarily get more sensitivity with a bigger pixel, but you tend to if the rest of the stuff in there, all the electronics, all the software behind it, all the hardware behind it are the same. An element that we need to know about as far as chip size. Bigger chips have a wider field of view. Bigger chips have more pixels, assuming that you're using the same size pixels. You get more megapixels. And the sensors that we use range from a full-size 35 millimeter, which is 36 across by 24 across, all the way down. These are the sensors on DSLRs generally, and these are the sensors on some newer DSLRs, and even smaller pixels are in some of those video cameras and our guide cameras. And there are some things you need to know about this. I know that there are still people out there that buy the DSLR so that they can get the telephoto effect. Well, the telephoto effect is not a telephoto effect. It's a crop effect. There's my M51 again. My M51, if we put this picture over the top of it, in other words, if we were to use a 35 millimeter frame, we'd get everything from the little baby galaxy, the secondary galaxy here, all the way up to the top of M51. But if we put a typical DSLR on it, we would lose all this stuff out here, and we would only get this stuff in the middle. So crop factor does not increase your focal length. It cuts out the edges of your picture. So you're not getting more telephoto. What you're getting is a pair of scissors to cut out the edges of your pictures. If you want to see how this works, I'd strongly suggest you go to that link right there and pull up the CCD calculator, although there are many calculators all over the place. This one has my 12-inch RC on it, and it's got my QSI 583. That's what I use to take this picture, and this picture is actually cropped a little bit. After I processed it, I just didn't like the way it was sitting. But you can see that I can visualize with this particular arrangement what my objects are going to look like. You can change this to some other telescope. You can change this to a different imager with a different sensor size. It'll tell you what your arc second coverage per pixel, what your chip size is. You can change this to different objects that you want to look at and see if you can fit the frame. There are many other ways to do this, but all hail to Ron Wadowski. He's a great guy, and I think we should still be using his program just because it's been around forever and it's really cool. And it's free, incidentally. One other thing about chip size and some notes: the display determines how much you need in megapixels. All right, unless you're cropping and zooming or printing, you cannot, with the cameras that we use today, you cannot fit your pictures onto a modern monitor. A 1920 by 1200 monitor only uses 2.3 megapixels. Most of our cameras are putting out 2 to 3 times that many megapixels worth of data. So be careful. Don't go crazy about the size of the chip you might need based on megapixels or anything else like that. Even an 8 by 10 only needs 7.2 megapixels at 300 dots per inch. So on the other hand, if you're going to crop, if you're going to shoot a big a galaxy or a small galaxy in a big field and then want to zoom it down on that particular galaxy, yeah, you might need more megapixels, but there are probably better ways to handle that, and we'll talk about that when we get into in 2 weeks when we get into talking about the big questions. Okay, any questions so far about pixel sizes? Or yeah, like I said, we're going to talk about that more about tubes and sensors later. Any questions coming in, David or Eric?
I don't see anything.
Okay. Cool. All right. I want to draw everybody's attention to this Hamamatsu's camera simulator, and I've got it sitting down here someplace. Where is it? Build a virtual camera. I'm still screen sharing, right? Okay. On my CCD, I can pick any one of a number of different cameras. Okay, but I'm going to leave it with my CCD, and I'm going to change my pixel size. Watch what happens to this over here. Okay, change my pixel size, and my data changes. I get blocky stars now. Here, I get round stars again, depending on my pixel size. Oh, let's see what happens when I change my read noise. You may not be able to pick that up on your YouTube because of the resolution, but this is a lot noisier when I increase the read noise. So you can change all your dark current, bring the dark current back down, change the gain, and so if you want to see the effect of these various things we've been talking about, quantum efficiency, full well capacity, watch what happens when we increase the full well capacity. Not much that way, but if we have read noise up here, full well capacity up there, now as the full well capacity comes down, we get a lot more noise, and we can't tell where the dots are in the picture so much anymore. So Hamamatsu has what they call a build a virtual camera. You could probably Google Hamamatsu build a virtual camera. The link is on the web page there, and let me get back to PowerPoint. and get back to the, there's the link. You can take that, and anybody wants to go look at all that stuff, it's kind of cool. And I don't want to show you the end there, you'll all get excited. Coming in a couple of weeks, we're going to take all the information we've just got and the language that we share now, and we're going to talk about some of the big issues in buying a new camera. Okay? And that, folks, is what we call the end. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you have, if you have any questions, and now is the time to go ahead and put them in. So let's see. How did we do? We get any other questions out there, guys?
I don't see any, David.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'll welcome you back in next week. Our presentation is going to be Cliff Ashcroft. He's going to be talking about resolving double stars with backyard gear. Beat the seeing and resolve double stars below half an arc second, and using the kind of equipment we can all afford. We can do it in our backyards. I encourage you all to continue to put in information about your images of the week. We're certainly looking forward to that. And once again, as I always do, I ask you to please try to get, if you've got anything that you want to put in, if you want to do a presentation, get in touch with Adam and get what you can out of that, okay, guys? But we need presenters. We need people that are willing to step up and say, hey, I built an observatory. I'm kind of proud of it. I'd like you to see how I handled all this stuff, and I'd like to take questions from you. Anybody got any of those kinds of things that you can do? Now, we do have Jason Whitener. I see Yanni has already, we've already answered that question. Jason, at what temperature does a cooled camera plateau as far as noise reduction? I know that there's a point of diminishing returns, and I think that's what you're calling it. On my QSI 583, it's at -20. All right, and other manufacturers are probably different. It gets down there. There's this what's it called, dark noise doubling, and you can, that's one of the specifications that you usually see, and it'll tell you that for every extra 5 degrees it'll decrease by so-and-so number of electrons. But you got to watch out for that number because it's not necessarily linear. That is, going from 10 degrees down to 5 degrees, it'll decrease a lot. But as the further down you go, it's asymptotic, whatever that word is, where it just stretches out. I would say it depends on your camera, but and if anybody else has anything to add on that, depends on your camera, but be sure you go ahead and get it down as low as it can go. Also, you'll find out in a couple of weeks when we talk about this stuff, there's a difference between cooling and regulated cooling. If you can regulate cooling, boy, it's a real step above. Cooling helps, but regulated cooling, where you know how cool it is and you can keep it that cool, helps a lot more.
Alex, I can add just a comment on that. From a practical point of view, I think I have a couple of cameras, and -20 is about as far down as it can go. That is the capacity of the refrigeration unit, the cooling unit, to draw down the temperature. It also depends on your outside temperature. If it's 0 degrees in Chicago, cooling is actually easy. You can go down to -30. If it's 30 degrees in Chicago, then you can probably only get down to -10 or -20 degrees C. So I generally run for our cameras either -20 or -30 degrees C. And below that, you really, your cooling system is working a lot harder, and you're really not decreasing the noise that much. So it tends not to be very practical. Now, of course, that's different with CMOS cameras and DSLRs, where you have to have extra cooling units put in there. We're just talking about CCDs right now.
Yeah, well, that is the difference between regulated cooling, and it's not a difference between CCDs and DSLRs. It's a difference between cooling and not cooling, because there are CCDs and there are CMOSs that do have regulated cooling, And so that's the distinction you have to draw. But yeah, Jason, I hope that answers your question. Anybody else have any questions that we need to direct ourselves to? Oh, Jason, I do want you to recall that one graph I showed in my PowerPoint where it showed the decrease as you went along. You'll probably find a graph like that in most camera specifications. So, any others? Then we're going to call it a night for tonight. Thank you for being here. Join us again. Keep your comments coming on the Astro-imaging channel. Volunteer to do a presentation. We hope to see you again next Sunday when Cliff's going to tell us about how to take those high-resolution split stars in our backyards with cheap stuff. Goodbye, everybody. Good night.